Well, good morning, delegates. Good morning, friends of delegates. Je suis américaine, mais je saisis cette occasion pour vous souhaiter les bienvenus au Canada et à Toronto. And I thank the Belinda Stronach Foundation for this wonderful opportunity to have a chance to speak to you about initiatives very important to International Center for Research on Women and Child Marriage. I have a daughter, Elise Yeri, who's a little bit younger than you. She's 16, and like you, she has big dreams and hopes and audacious goals for herself. She plans to go to college, study journalism, and be rich and famous. She's a little bit of a North American teen drama queen. But, fortunately, she'll outgrow the drama, and with time, she'll accomplish all that she has set out for herself, and more. For Elise Yeri, my sweet 16 Ivorian American daughter, the world is full of possibilities. In my work with the International Center for Research on Women, I'm constantly reminded about the stark difference between the opportunities that Elise has in her life and those of girls her age throughout much of the developing world. At age 16, many girls around the world have been taken out of school, perhaps because their families couldn't afford school fees, or as it was said earlier, they need to care for family members, or tradition dictates that they should marry and have children. The statistics never fail to shock me. There are more than 50 million child brides in the world today. And demographic trends indicate that nearly half of the 331 million girls in developing countries are expected to marry before their 20th birthday. You're taking very careful notes. Here's an important fact. At this rate, 100 million more girls, 25,000 girls a day, will become child brides in the next decade. We've heard a little bit about why child marriage happens. It's most common in poor and particularly rural communities. For example, a girl from the poorest household in Senegal is 4 times likely to marry before age 18 as the girl in a richest household. And why? Because as we've heard earlier, there are few economic alternatives for girls to earn an income, and where educating girls costs money for families, it might be easier to marry them off to relieve that economic burden. In some ways, we're at a very good point in time. The issue of child marriage has gained so much traction across the world that I could go to any major newspaper and find you a story, a heartbreaking story, about a young girl who has been married to a much older man in some remote corner of the world. But I'd like to make this more personal. Can you see it? This is a photo of Orjanon, a lovely girl who was born in a rural village in Burkina Faso and was married at the age of 16 to Jean-Pierre Olo, 8 years her senior. She is one of 4 wives in a poor, polygamous household in northern Ivory Coast. What will her life be as a child bride? And more importantly, how does the practice of child marriage affect an entire community, if not a nation? Usually girls who marry young lose their chance to go to school. When girls are taken out of school to get married, they lose their best chance to gain knowledge and confidence, to discover what life may hold for them, and to develop competency as citizens and leaders. Many young girls become socially isolated once they are married. Most of the time, they aren't able to work outside of their husband's household, which means they have little or no opportunity to earn money for themselves or to contribute income to the household. Early marriage has dire consequences on their health. It leads to early sexual activity and usually leads to early childbearing. In Chad, Guinea, Mali, Niger, where child marriage is quite prevalent, half of all girls give birth before their 18th birthday. And many of you are 18. The risks of pregnancy are much, much higher for young girls and I know that Jill will talk more about this when she addresses you. But girls younger than 15 are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than women in their 20s, and pregnancy is the leading cause of death worldwide for women ages 15 to 19. Because of the sexual activity, young married women are also more vulnerable to HIV and AIDS. In sub-Saharan Africa, growing evidence suggests that married girls are at greater risk of HIV infection than sexually active unmarried girls. Why? Because girls are often married to older men who've had more lifetime sexual partners. Social norms severely limit a young bride's ability to negotiate condom use, so these young girls are at heightened risk for HIV infection, a risk that further curtails their own lifetime opportunities as well as those of their children. And finally, as Pamela and Swan both said, young women and child brides in particular are just much more vulnerable to domestic violence. And this violence can take many forms: physical, psychological, sexual abuse, economic violence. Girls who marry before 18 are much more likely to experience domestic violence than their peers who marry later in life. So what are the costs of child marriage? Why do you need to think about child marriage? Because the costs are high for the individual girl, for her children, and for the society she lives in. Countries with high child marriage rates also have high rates of maternal and child mortality, as well as extreme and persistent poverty. Just think about it. If you remove such a large portion of the population that could be working in the mainstream community, then economies cannot grow, political systems cannot flourish, and human rights are not realized. The practice of child marriage stunts the growth of girls, and it stunts the social and economic development of communities. But just as with violence, child marriage is preventable. There are things that we know that we can do. We have the knowledge in hand. One of the most important strategies is education. It's the most powerful deterrent against child marriage. Girls with secondary schooling are up to 6 times less likely to marry as children when compared to girls who have little or no education. Educated girls are more likely to have skills that can lead to jobs, which give them alternatives to marriage. They are also more likely to have skills and information to negotiate life choices, whether or not to marry, whether or not to bear children, whether or not to seek a higher education. Income-generating opportunities also help delay marriages for girls. When families see that girls have the opportunity to earn income, they may see that marriage is not the only option for economic security. So what works? Let me talk a little bit about the experience of ICRW and our work in India. We all seem to be going to India. While child marriage is quite common, the reason for it is complex, it is preventable. My organization has been involved in several projects that have been successful in delaying age of marriage. In Maharashtra, India, we are working with IHMP, or the International Health Management Budget. Over the course of the program with the girls, IHMP provides life skills training to the girls on the following topics: social issues and institutions. How do you use a post office? How do you use a bank? How do you get your voter registration card? Citizenship and claiming rights. How do you go get water for the village? Who do you talk to in the village? How do you negotiate that pathway? Child health and nutrition, sexual and reproductive health. Most importantly, the program also involved parents and local leaders in designing and monitoring the program so that they felt comfortable about the program and were invested in its results, a very important component. So what are the results? For a research center, we really love data. After 2 years, the median age at marriage, you can think about the age in the middle there, of all the girls who've been married, had increased by 1 full year, from 16 to 17 years. That's a significant achievement because it shows that social practice can change in a very short period of time. It has to be sustained. But when people understand the issues and are involved in the solutions, they can make it happen. Community mobilization is essential, but it's not sufficient. Child marriage is a symptom of a much greater failure to provide adequate education, economic opportunity, and protection to girls and to women. It's too big of a problem to rely on communities and non-governmental organizations to solve. We must commit to a global partnership, a Girl Effect movement, that includes communities, national governments, multilateral institutions like the United Nations, and the G20. And you, the next leaders of the world, can help the effort by advocating with your governments and with the G20. You can leave this conference and make a difference in someone's life. All governments need to invest in education for girls. We've come a long way toward meeting the Millennium Development Goal 3 to promote gender equality and empower women by making progress on eliminating gender disparity in primary and secondary education. Did you know that? You really need secondary education too to be able to go over that lump, that little gap there. But we need to do more than just ensure that girls and boys are staying in school. We need to focus on quality, we need to focus on retention, and we need to make sure that they are getting the skills to achieve their full potential. Governments need to redouble their efforts to end poverty and meet MDG 1 to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, which will give poor and rural communities around the world more choices for their families, real choices. And finally, governments need to take a stand against child marriage by raising the legal age of marriage and making child marriage illegal in their country, and ensuring that that's not just enshrined in wonderfully worded legislation at the national level, but articulates right down through the judicial system and is enacted on the ground, that people have access to justice for these issues. My country, the United States, in the Congress is currently considering a critical bill called the International Protecting Girls by Preventing Child Marriage Act. This bill will require the U.S. government to develop an integrated, strategic approach to the prevention of child marriage. And very importantly, it will hold the U.S. government accountable by requiring the State Department to address the status of children in the annual country reports on human rights practice. With political will at high levels and with sustained investment in the development of communities, I'm optimistic that we can greatly reduce, if not eliminate, the practice of child marriage in my lifetime. Would you do that for me, please? Take that on. So as you convene over the next few days, think about the girls who can't be here, whose bright futures have been shadowed by adult responsibilities and by violations of their basic human rights. Let's think about what we all can do to help those girls and young women be all that they can be, and to give future generations of girls the choices they didn't have. And what about lovely Orjanon? In many ways, her story has turned out better than most. I neglected to tell you that she was born in 1936, not a contemporary child bride, but a child bride nonetheless. Her husband was respectful, caring, and hardworking. She carried 9 pregnancies to term, but nearly died with the birth of her 9th child. Her husband wanted more children, but Orjanon's oldest son found the courage to beg his father to let her stop. And fortunately, he did. Have you guessed? Orjanon Kambou is Yeri's grandmother, my mother-in-law, who despite being poor and uneducated herself, brewed beer and sold vegetables to pay school fees so that each and every one of her 9 children could complete primary and secondary school. She was determined that they would lead a better life, and education was the key. Can you imagine the contribution such an enterprising and determined woman could make in her community if she had been offered an education rather than being forced to marry at 16? When I look at all of you, when I think of my own daughter and of my mother-in-law, I am tremendously hopeful for the future. Social change is possible. Child marriage is preventable, and you can do something about it. In closing, I'm reminded of a famous quote. What a brave new world that has such people in it. Let's start at once. Thank you very much.